Thanks, David.
Sure, of course. And so tell me a little bit about kind of where Drawbridge came from. It's been a very fascinating company to like to watch from the outside, and kind of where did the idea come from, and kind of where are you at now?
Yeah, the journey starts from my days at one of the early mobile pioneers, a company called AdMob. This was about 10 years back, pre-smartphone devices, when we had those flip phone or feature phone devices. There was an entire economy that was, springing up around advertising in mobile, but so challenging. I mean, the carriers had so much control over the mobile device at the time. Right now, this device, we're talking about a real operating system. It's almost a computing device at this time. So the kinds of things that you're able to do to market to consumers much more intelligently today were certainly just aspirations at the time. So at the time, obviously, today there's still challenges, many a challenge in mobile, but understanding the mobile consumer meant that you had to connect the consumer to other sort of environments, other platforms, other devices, screens, et cetera, that they were engaging in. And we used to talk about this a lot at AdMob. It was about finding sort of the right solution, the right sort of technology to be able to solve for the connectivity and identity problem. Knowing that there were some solutions like Facebook and Google, et cetera, who had a very good understanding around consumer identity. So the genesis of this company starts from sort of the early pioneering days in mobile, about a decade back or so.
So what are some of the kinds of things that you can do now in terms of identity and, I guess, following consumers that you weren't able to do then?
Yeah, I think when we first started the company, a lot of our thinking was about connecting that mobile consumer to the other devices that they owned. So it was more about creating a digital map of the consumer, right? And that basically, I think the way you would think about this is you're talking about developing technology and science to be able to create a digital map of a consumer in terms of every environment, platform, device, screen, et cetera, that they're interacting with. That itself is a pretty high bar from a challenge perspective in terms of developing real technology to solve for that, right? So if you talk about sort of the start of the company till now, we're talking about a tremendous evolution from a technology, science, algorithmic, big data, systems perspective, that we are able to do it as a credible alternative to a login or a registration handle. That's effectively what we have done as a company, right? On top of that, identity doesn't start and end at the fact that we have a digital map. This conference, Street Fight, is all about how sort of location and offline is very much a part of identifying a consumer as well. So that's been some of the ways in which we have evolved our technology at Drawbridge to be able to create a full consumer identity map that's not simply a digital map.
And originally it was more focused around advertising, or I guess just sort of online advertising and programmatic generally. Tell me a little bit about how the data business has developed since then, and kind of, I guess, what are you doing differently now?
Yeah, I think as I said, the genesis of this company is about a decade back, right? And the problemscape started from how do we make advertising to consumers or marketing to consumers smarter. That's sort of where we started at. And as you sort of think about the problem, in fact, the market taught us this. Identity is far more foundational and far more far-reaching. It starts with advertising because some of the biggest giants at Google and Facebook have such a good understanding of consumer identity. So there is a need in the broader ecosystem to be able to use identification in smarter ways to develop smarter advertising tools. But that doesn't end there. In terms of how experiences for consumers are personalized is hinged on identity. Secure experiences online is hinged on identity. So those are the ways in which our application and our identity data is being deployed in all these sort of interesting use cases and categories.
And is it developing an alternative to Facebook and Google and their kind of information?
I think that's a sort of great way to sort of position this and even think about this. So we say that we kind of would like to think about what Drawbridge does as democratizing identity. Google and Facebook have sort of this kind of unfortunate position of this, mostly fortunate, about sort of being this walled garden where sort of this vault of data and tremendous amount of consumer data. And identity is at the heart of it. So here's a company, Drawbridge, that is effectively democratizing this identity and making it accessible for a variety of different use cases, applications, products, platforms, in a much needed way. Identity is at the heart of every use case and application, especially considering today's consumer behavior, right? It's so fragmented. It's so fragmented across different screens, environments, platforms, et cetera. So identity is at the heart of it. And we are basically an open alternative to a solution where Google and Facebook will not be so.
And how important is location to identity? And I mean, in first in sort of creating identities for people, but also like how does location data interact with identity data?
Actually, someone a while back mentioned to me that location was basically the cookie ID of online, if you may. Right? I mean, if you kind of frame it that way and phrase it that way, it is tremendously critical towards identifying a consumer, identifying a user. It's a harder problem in some ways, and it's about how much consumer relationship do you have such that you are rightfully so being able to map their behavior and acquire the data rightfully so by doing right by the consumer to create that kind of offline map. So it's extremely critical. It's about, it can be particularly more challenging depending on the ways and means, and rightfully so acquiring the data and mapping it to a consumer activity. And when I say rightfully so, you always want to solve this problem such that you're not sort of elevating the creepiness factor from a user's perspective. So that's sort of some of the things that we constantly bear in mind. We want to develop solutions that are doing right by the consumer from a data practice and a compliance perspective.
So you mentioned the creepiness factor, and someone else earlier today mentioned, just even 5 or 6 years ago when we started Street Fight, 7 years ago was when we started Street Fight, just the idea of like volunteering your location data for your phone to a lot of people seemed creepy, like checking into Foursquare, like why do you want anybody to know where you are? Has that changed over time? Like, are people more comfortable with just the amount of data that's known about them?
I think it's a sliding bar. I would say that comfort is, relatively speaking, probably there's more awareness. I wouldn't say that. I think if you ask sort of an average person walking down the street, what would they feel about this? I wouldn't say that 5 years before and now, the level of comfort has tremendously transformed. I think the way in which we would like to think about this is the purposes for identification, including that of location data, is what is very important. If you're talking about advertising and tracking, sort of for advertising purposes, there's sort of one view to it. If you're talking about making consumer experiences delightful and you're talking about creating a more secure experience for consumers online, which is a very hot button topic today, I think there's sort of a different perspective around it. That's how we would like to think about sort of the applications for identity, if you may.
But I mean, that's sort of a sliding scale. To one person, like giving a delightful consumer experience is also selling them a hamburger.
Absolutely.
Are there any sort of developments in voice search and AR and VR that are kind of affecting the way that you're using this kind of data?
I would say less probably AR or VR. I think some of the ways in which I think there are a few words that can transform companies' fortunes today. Blockchain and
AI.
crypto X and AR. I would say I think there are some very interesting applications of blockchaining and identity that are something that we are certainly considering at Drawbridge. There are many companies that are developing solutions. Certainly it's a very sort of emerging phenomena. When I'm saying companies developing solutions, they're all sort of very emerging technologies and emerging companies. But I think if we give ourselves another 5-10 years from now, I think the ways in which blockchaining would impact the ways in which we identify ourselves online, it would be sort of a different world that we're thinking about. It would be very integral and critical to it.
Well, explain a little more about that. Is it in the sense that you can have more anonymity and participate more?
Exactly. The more anonymity, more transparency, more accountability is effective, and without the compromise of sort of privacy from a consumer perspective. Drawbridge is arguably an enterprise identity company, right? We are effectively talking about powering an entire ecosystem of products, services, platforms, brands, marketers with an identity capability. This kind of idea around how we would involve or leverage blockchaining technology towards identification takes us one step closer to be able to offer consumer identification capabilities that probably one day we would even replace the whole phenomena of logging in and providing in passwords. There are ways in which our experiences online are going to be changing by the ways in which we leverage blockchaining. And that's where it becomes a consumer identity solution, not necessarily an enterprise identity solution.
And in the sense that you could also extend it to small businesses and that kind of thing too, for price points and that kind of
I'm talking about more sort of how our solution or a enterprise identity solution, when it becomes a consumer identity solution, we are talking about consumers. Basically, think about a world where no more are you logging in and providing a password. Your ability to identify yourself is carried by a very secure certificate that you have on your phone. You have a QR code. There are QR codes that recognize yourself, you as a user, on your different devices. You automatically are signed in. There is no more sort of entering these pesky passwords and forgetting them and resetting them with multi-factor authentication, etc. That becomes a consumer identity solution, right? So that's sort of the world I think blockchains, etc., can influence in a big way. And certainly if we continue to innovate as a company, certainly that would be an interesting place for us to play in.
And so, but you're still doing quite a bit in advertising, obviously, and as you personalize advertising more and more, has that, originally when sort of programmatic became very widespread, online ad rates dropped very precipitously. Is that coming back up as you have more personalization of advertising?
I think, advertising, how much ever, excuse my sort of word here, is bastardized. It's sort of the way in which sort of bills are paid on the internet, right? Having accepted that, we expect sort of freemium to be the world, to be the means by which we interact with the world, digital world around us. So I think the best that we can do from an advertising perspective is to make it more relevant, more personalized, and less jarring. And that's effectively where identity certainly plays a very key role. Not only from the consumer experience perspective, but it also plays a key role from a marketer's perspective, from an advertiser's perspective, who has to measure an ROI around sort of delivery or media spend. And that's where I would say identity is so critical, not both from a consumer perspective, but from a marketer perspective as well. And the ways in which, as you continue to personalize, certainly there are better experiences, higher engagement rates, but then also there is less saturation and less spray and pray.
So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. You get asked a lot, I've read a bunch of interviews, and you get asked a lot about what it's like to be a female CEO in Silicon Valley. And I wanted to sort of turn it around and ask, sort of not, why have you been successful where others have not, but what can we do to empower more young women to get into technology and to get into, this kind of stuff?
It's always a question I contend with, and I'd like to sort of participate. I don't know if I have a magic bullet answer around it. At least I can share some of my personal experiences. I think to quote Michelle Obama, probably not quote, at least paraphrase some of what she said, it's cool to be sort of geeky. It's cool to be interested in science and math. It's cool to be interested in sort of the STEM disciplines. Sometimes popular culture around us kind of influences our thinking in a certain way, and especially that introduces some unfortunate gender biases as well. I think sort of hopefully my experience and many other women like myself are basically examples of the fact that this is totally possible, this is totally doable, and be that in the form of role models or experiences that we have built, creates sort of avenues for younger women, girls, etc., to say that A, this is cool, B, this is doable, C, this is achievable. I should go give it a shot.
And was there something that happened either while you were at Google or earlier in your career that kind of like just flipped a switch?
I think from my perspective, it's sort of a lot of personal drive, and I think there is sort of this interesting phenomena I've sort of shared at times is the number of women around me has precipitously sort of decreased from my days in school, high school, college, engineering, advanced engineering, PhD, starting a company, entrepreneurship. It's always sort of precipitously dropped. I'd say that some of my my experience has been driven by the fact that risk and appetite and the excitement of a journey has driven me more than necessarily trying to find people who look or sound like me around me. That mattered to me less. Yeah. So I guess that sort of was my trigger, and that has served me well so far. Hopefully it continues to do so.
Cool. And so just sort of, we write a lot at Street Fight about kind of culture and the culture of building companies. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the biggest lessons you've learned in building Drawbridge and kind of like, you said you're about 150 employees now. Kind of what are some of the stages along the way that like were big milestones?
Yeah, I'd say that the first 10 and the first 50 and the first 75, first 100 has sort of been kind of, from my perspective, sort of, leaps in terms of how companies transform, people evolve, and how groups of people come together to work best with each other. My biggest learning experiences are, so ideas are a dime a dozen. It is more about, obviously it's more about execution, and execution is primarily driven by people. So my biggest learning experience, certainly in the last 6 years of building Drawbridge, has been finding the right people to go along with you in the journey of building a company. It is not an individual exercise, it's a team exercise. Hiring, and talent. And I think there was sort of this exponential rule that Google had in the early days. You always find, every person has to find one person who's smarter than them, so one goes to two, two goes to four, and sort of...
In terms of hiring people smarter than you, or?
Hiring people smarter than me. That's sort of my second, if you say, take the foundational experience of talent and hiring the right people, the next sort of step on top of that is always find people who are smarter than you. They will keep you on the, sort of in the right direction, hold you accountable in many ways, help you get better, and sort of, that's sort of the interesting journey that we go after.
And what are some of the things that you do to sort of build culture at the company?
I think some of the sort of most important aspects from my perspective is, at least when I was sort of in the early days of my career, I like to have a seat at the table. I'd like to know more. I'd like to understand sort of the strategic directions and impetus of the company. I think information is power, right? It helped me shape how well I did what I did in the company, in the group, in my project, in my work. So I think that is something that has stood true to me. So for example, at Drawbridge, some of our key metrics of performance is not just an executive summary. It is available to everyone in the company so that it empowers them to understand how the company is doing. Transparency is another key sort of aspect of it. Having sort of open forums on a very regular basis. When I say regular, I'm talking about monthly regular, to a point where everybody comes, 150 people dial in from various parts of the country and have a chance to be able to not just speak to the CEO, the founder, the executive team, their managers, or key team members. We are talking about it as sort of as an open communication forum. I think some of that, if you can hold true to yourself and certainly to the spirit of the company, it kind of helps as you continue to scale, because that transparency needs to scale across the organization. It cannot just simply be at the founder and the CEO level.
Cool. Well, so we've got about a couple minutes left. I want to just open up to the audience for a couple of questions. There's a microphone over there. Or not, or we could talk more about programmatic advertising. Or, I don't know, I guess what are some of the big projects you're working on for 2018, and what are you most excited about kind of trending within?
A lot of our investment in 2018 is about how do we continue to develop the capabilities around identity and make it more real-time, make it more sort of featureful, such that we are able to power all these sort of adjacent categories beyond AdTech and MarTech. See, AdTech and MarTech has this interesting sort of position that most companies, most platforms in this category, again, going back to sort of the statement around, it could be sort of, the consumer's view around advertising is different than sort of the ecosystem's view around advertising. Sure. But it's one of the most, I would say, innovative categories in the sense that most ad tech companies have a big data backend. So they're doing some very interesting things with data per se, period, right? So for us, the natural fit into ad tech and MarTech from an identity perspective was very logical. But learning from that and expanding into other, and effectively true to our name, drawing the bridge into other categories such as personalization, such as security, authentication, authorization, etc. That's where our product roadmap and our strategy is this year. It's about how we draw the bridge as a company that innovated in ad tech, but is drawing the bridge to all these other categories. Sort of where some of our unique position and our capabilities are.
So when you say draw the bridge, it's not like a drawbridge like over a moat, it's more like drawing a bridge?
Drawing the bridge. That's why I'm kind of, no pun intended there is effectively what I meant. I'd say another sort of beauty of the ad tech ecosystem is it's such a sort of fire hose of data. It's about, there are a few companies that harness the data to be able to create some really interesting solutions. And once you create once a solution is identity. And that solution can be accessible and can empower so many other categories such as security, authentication, etc. That's sort of the drawing of the bridge that I was alluding to.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for coming such a long way to be with us today.
No, absolutely. It was such a pleasure.
And now we have, I think, a 30-minute break. So it's come back in 30 minutes, please.